If you enjoy this video, please consider giving a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And if you have any ideas for future videos, share them in the comments section below. This original bedtime story is made possible thanks to Slumberland patrons. If you would like to support this channel, you can find Patreon details in the description and on my channel homepage. So just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to comfortably drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this sleep story in the background. And I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or whether it'll be to the spaces between my words. And this is a story about Michael. And Michael is one day walking along the edge of a stream, smelling some tulips that are growing near that stream. And he's smelling those tulips, listening to the flowing sound of that stream as it trickles by, noticing the occasional wispy cloud passing overhead, hearing the slight rustle of the leaves in the nearby trees as the wind blows a breeze, feeling the breeze on his face, on his cheeks, and just enjoying the peace and calmness of the moment. And as he continues to walk along, so he starts to hear a sound, and it's a slight rumbling sound coming from just the other side of the trees somewhere in the woods. And so he begins to walk away from the stream. He turns into that woodland, and as he very comfortably and gently walks into those woods, you can notice that sound getting louder and louder. He continues to follow that sound, the crunching sound of his footsteps as he pushes through those trees, the mottled light shining down through the canopy above, until he finds a slight clearing, and in that clearing he sees a griffin. And for a moment he stops a little startled, and then the griffin beckons him over, and so he carefully, calmly walks over to that griffin. And the griffin tells him that he's been sent here to tell Michael that he needs to find the last Dodo and get that last Dodo safely to a sanctuary. And Michael asks, why him? And the griffin says that that's the message they've been told to pass on. That those sending the message know that he is the one who'll figure it out. And that he's to go to the nearby old library where he'll find a book that'll teach him how to find that Dodo. And then that griffin takes off and flies away. And Michael is curious about the experience he's just had, thinking it seemed a very strange experience. He'd never seen a griffin before, And had he not seen that griffin with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed that such a creature existed. He also thought that dodos had gone extinct, and so couldn't understand why he would be searching for the last dodo. And even if he got it to the sanctuary, if it is the last dodo, he doesn't know what use it would be rescuing that one creature. But he is curious to follow this mission and find this out for himself. And so he heads back through that woodland, all the way back to that stream, and he follows that stream as it trickles along beside him, all the way to a bridge. He walks over that bridge, follows the stream on the other side, until turning off across a meadow, heading to a nearby town. And once in the town, he heads towards the old library, and he can see that old library at the top of the town, a really old building with grand architecture out the front. He heads into that library, passes all the modern day books, heads upstairs in the library to where all the old books are kept, and he can hear the dull sound of each footstep he takes as he walks across the carpeted floor, that old book smell filling the air. The slightest quiet murmur of others in the library, the dullness to the sound as the books, the carpet, absorb much of the reverb of sound in the library. And he searches the shelves for that old book he was told to find. He doesn't even know if the old book exists. He doesn't know how much of this is real, but is surprised when he finds that old book. And it's a heavy, large book. He carefully takes that leather-bound book off from the shelf, carries it over to an oak table, places it carefully down on that table, and gently opens the cover and begins to turn the pages. And he flicks through those pages until he recognizes what looks like a spell to do with the dodo. And he notes down the instructions. And this spell seems to be a spell that will allow him to be able to track that last dodo. And he doesn't know if there even is a last dodo. And he starts thinking to himself, if there isn't a last dodo, how will I know whether the spell has done anything, because it won't have anything to track? So I won't know if the spell has gone wrong and it hasn't done anything, or if the spell has worked fine, there just isn't a last dodo. But he thinks that it's worth trying anyway. So he leaves the library with these instructions. He heads to a location that was mentioned in the book, where he'll apparently find an enchanted forest. And it starts off looking like an ordinary woods. He walks into that woodland, and he follows that woodland all the way to a cliff. And at the top of this cliff is meadows and further woodland. But at the bottom of this cliff, he notices a narrow crevice. He squeezes along that crevice, shimmying sideways along that crevice. And it just looks dark, like the crevice just goes on and then at some point will end. But instead of ending, he passes a point where he can notice light, and he carries on along this crevice and realizes he must have passed through a narrow portal in this crevice. He continues along this crevice towards the light. And as he exits the other side of this crevice, so he can see glowing, twinkling light just floating around in the air in this forest this side of the crevice. He can notice the way that as the breeze blows through the forest, so the breeze seems to move the plant life, and as that plant life moves and sways in the breeze, so sparkles of light and glowing emanate from those plants, and an almost twinkling sound spreading from those plants. And he heads into that forest, and it's the most beautiful collection of colour and light that he's ever seen. He follows the forest to a stream, and in this enchanted stream he can see streams of light travelling with the flow of the water and dancing in the water. And he follows the instructions from the book. He begins to pan for gold. He sits on the edge of the stream, placing a pan into the stream, gathering up some sediment and some of the stones from in the stream, and gently panning it around, allowing the water to flow out. And from time to time he notices the tiniest specks of gold, and he gathers up each speck of gold. And continues to pan. And after many hours of panning at this stream, he has a little container with enough gold to use. He then continues his journey through this enchanted forest. He gathers up a bottle of the fluorescent, glowing, enchanted stream water. He carries that with him. He carries his container of bits of gold with him. And he hunts around this enchanted forest, looking for the different ingredients. He heads to a plant that has a large bell-shaped petals, almost like a giant bluebell. He picks a few of those bells from the stem, and as he picks them, so the most beautiful, sweet, fragrant smell emanates from where that was picked. He continues through this forest. He can hear the occasional sound of birds and other pleasant sounds in this forest, thinking this seems such a relaxing and calming place. He heads to the edge of the forest, and at the edge of the forest he discovers the last plant he needs to pick from, and they're giant sunflowers, and so he climbs a tree near one of the sunflowers to climb up that tree to the height of the flower itself, and then scoops out some of the centre of that sunflower and takes some of the petals from the sunflower before descending that tree again. He then heads back near that stream, settles down near that stream, lights a campfire, gets a pan over the fire, places the fluorescent water from the stream into that pan, and as that water heats up, begins to bubble and sparkle more and more. He places in the gold and begins to place in the other ingredients, and he stirs those ingredients in that pan as that water boils down and evaporates off, until what's left begins to form a paste, and that paste seems to glow with a slight golden purple glow. And he stirs that paste as it gets thicker and thicker, until it almost seems to begin to turn into a ball as he's stirring it in that pan. He then follows the instructions to take the pan off the heat and leave that pan to cool down, allowing the mixture to cool down. And as it cools down a little bit more, so it begins to glow brighter and brighter. And once it's cooled down enough for him to spread, he spreads it around the tip of a stick, almost like the end of a torch. He then places that stick in the ground while he allows that to continue to cool further and further, and as it cools, so it solidifies more and more. And while it solidifies more and more, so the glow gets more intense. And while it continues to solidify, Michael rests back, decides to relax for a while. He closes his eyes and drifts and floats, so peacefully, so comfortably asleep. And a number of hours later, as the fire is burning down to embers, Michael awakens and he can see that the light on that stick is now glowing incredibly brightly. He packs everything away, picks up that stick. He begins to turn around holding that stick, and he notices as he points the stick in front of him and turns around that in some directions the stick is even brighter. In other directions the stick dims, and so he follows the direction when the stick is brightest. And it takes him through the enchanted forest, takes him out into an enchanted meadow with knee-high grass and flowers, which twinkle and sparkle and ring like gentle bells as his legs brush through that grass with each step that he takes. And he continues to follow that light. As he gazes up, he can see the most beautiful patches of colour in the sky, the most beautiful blanket of stars, and notices that those stars and the blanket of stars don't look like what he's used to seeing when he looks up. He continues through this meadow, before eventually finding some more trees and heading into a different forest. Follows that light as it illuminates the forest, with shadows dancing from the trees, the branches, the shadows of the branches stretching out and moving as the light passes, the rustling sound of the leaves overhead. And he follows this light through the forest in the direction that he hopes to find a dodo. And eventually he arrives at a cave. He heads into that cave. As he walks into the cave, so the outside sounds fade away. He can hear the slightest sound of dripping water in this cave. The light dancing off the cave walls as he continues deeper and deeper into the cave. And after a while, the cave opens up and he can see that there's a bridge over a deep ravine. And he heads towards that bridge. And just as he is arriving at the bridge, an ogre steps in his way. And the ogre tells him that he can't cross that bridge. And Michael explains that he needs to cross the bridge. He's in search of the last dodo. And the ogre says only someone pure of heart can cross this bridge to the chamber on the other side. And Michael says, I need to find and rescue this last dodo. I need to take it to a sanctuary. You're going to be able to do whatever you choose to do. But I'm going to save that dodo. And Michael begins to walk towards the bridge. And as he walks towards the bridge, so in a puff of coloured smoke, the ogre vanishes, as Michael's proved his truth and love and honesty as he walks across that bridge over the ravine to the other side, to the cavern, to the other side, to a chamber. And when he gets to that chamber, he pushes aside a large stone door. Walks into that chamber, and under the light of his stick, he can see that there's a picture on the far wall. He heads over to that picture and notices it's a picture of a forest. And he reaches out to that picture as the light seems to be strongest when facing the picture. And as his hand gently touches the picture, so it seems to pass through that picture. And as it passes through that picture, he decides to follow his hand and he steps into that picture, finding himself in that forest. And in this forest, it's incredibly still and quiet. It's very dark. And so he follows the light through the forest, aware of that stillness, until he starts to hear a slight sound of footsteps, like a bird walking around on the ground, and occasionally pecking and disturbing the ground. And then he sees a dodo, and he crouches down and talks softly and in a friendly way, and encourages that dodo to come to him. And the dodo heads over to him and almost instinctively just climbs into his arms. And he picks the dodo up, and carrying that dodo, he heads back towards the picture. And that stick now just has a bright, static light, because it's right next to the dodo that it has been tracking. And he heads through this quiet forest, back through that picture, through the chamber, over the bridge, through that cave, through the forest the other side of the cave, back through the meadow, back through the enchanted forest, all the way back to that narrow path, and carefully, with the dodo held at his side, he squeezes through that narrow path, through the portal in that path, and out into the normal woodland. Heads through that woodland. He heads back with that dodo through the forest, all the way back and out into that meadow. And this time he knows that instead of heading to the main enchanted forest he'd arrived in, he's to head down to the shore. So he heads down through the meadow until he arrives at the seashore. And on the seashore, he sees a Viking boat moored up by the shore. He can see the calm water lapping on the shore, and thinks that off in the distance he can notice the occasional flash of lightning. And he boards that Viking ship, stows away the Dodo safely, and on their journey they encounter low-lying fog. And as they travel through the fog, trying to find and keep en route to the destination, a manatee suddenly appears by the boat and begins to weave its way on the left and the right side of the boat, helping to keep the boat on track to the destination. And so they follow that manatee as they travel through that dense fog, until eventually they reach land, and the Viking boat moors up by the land. Michael takes the Dodo, leaves that boat, walks into the forest on this land, through the forest, and then begins to ascend a mountain. And as he climbs that mountain higher and higher, so he passes through vegetation and then through dry area, almost devoid of all vegetation, just the occasional small hardy shrub, and continues to climb as it gets colder and colder, heading up into the snowy mountains. And he ascends higher and higher, carefully carrying that Dodo with him. And he can see way up in this mountain what looks like a door in an archway and a long stone wall. And he climbs all the way to that heavy wooden door. He knocks on that door, and after a few moments, the door carefully opens, and he's surprised to see that the other side of that door looks like the most beautiful sanctuary, full of wildlife, that's got bright sunshine, that's warm, the most calm and pleasant land. And he realizes that that doorway opens up into a portal. On the other side of the door is this land. He walks through that doorway with the Dodo. The door's closed behind him. As he looks around, he can see different animals that he knows have gone extinct. He can also see mystical creatures he's never seen before, and is surprised to notice that there are imps walking around, looking after and tending to all these animals, making sure that they're all okay. And one of those imps comes over, talks to Michael, thanks him for what he has done, rescuing this last Dodo. And they take that Dodo from him, and he walks with the imp as the imp walks to where they're going to release the dodo into an environment similar to what the dodo is used to and likes. They let that dodo go, and it runs off, and then, after it's travelled a little distance from them, it becomes comfortable and begins to just feed, pecking around at the ground, pulling at bits on the ground. And the imp talks about this sanctuary, how it's been here for thousands of years, as a safe haven for those animals and the mystical creatures that are becoming rare, that run the risk of extinction, and that this land has multiple portals to different lands for different types of environments. And the imps here tend to these animals, look after these animals, make sure that they're all fed and that they all survive well. And that nothing here dies. That everything here that needs to be saved is maintained as a record of the history of life. And the imp shows Michael all the way back to the exit. He heads through that heavy wooden door, descends that mountain in the snow, travels all the way back to the coast, boards that Viking ship. The Viking ship heads back towards the mainland. And back on the mainland, Michael walks through the meadow, back through that enchanted forest, back to that hole in the wall, shimmies along that hole in the wall, until he comes out into that woodland, heads through the woodland, and finds his way home. And as he's walking home, so he encounters that griffin again, who thanks him for his help before flying off. And once home, Michael realizes that it seems to be almost like time had stood still for many hours. That the journey, which seemed to take a long time, doesn't seem to have actually taken that long at all. And he settles down in bed, thinking about that dodo, about that land, the other animals he saw, curious whether he could ever visit, just to see what else is there. And while thinking about that, he rests and relaxes down into his bed, snuggles up and drifts and floats, so peacefully, so comfortably, asleep, knowing he'll wake in the morning, feeling so full of energy, revitalized and ready for the day ahead, drifting and floating so peacefully, so comfortably, asleep.